We have two guests from UC Davis, go Aggies. One is going to join us virtually, and the other is here in person. So Mason Earles is from UC Davis, or the faculty at UC Davis in viticulture and enology and biological and agricultural engineering. He leads the plant AI and biophysics lab. He draws on experience at Apple and academic research to develop AI-powered sensing and automation systems that improve plant health monitoring and support sustainable, precise agriculture. Elisabeth Forrestel is assistant professor at UC Davis and studies how grapes respond to drought and heat, helping mitigate climate change and impacts on viticulture. Her work integrates vineyard monitoring and remote sensing to better understand environmental effects on plant growth, berry chemistry, and wine quality. If you could both give me a virtual hand, Mason is going to join us. There he is, and you are live and ready to go.
All right. Am I coming through all right on you guys' end?
We can hear you just fine.
Great, perfect. All right, I'll get going then. I'm going to share my screen. So first of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for having me today, especially Napa Valley grape growers. I know this is an awesome event, truly, that I think really bridges the gap between what's going on the research side, the technology side, and what growers care about. So I'm excited to be here. I'm going to be speaking almost entirely from my UC Davis hat. I wear a couple hats, as I think some of you know. That is of associate professor at UC Davis, but then also as co-founder and CTO of Scout, which we've spun out of our lab at UC Davis. So I'm going to be wearing all except for the last slide. I just want to kind of give a shout out to tech transfer piece, mostly my UC Davis hat at this point. So I'm going to talk for a bit. Beth and I have been brewing a lot of ideas for several years now, having worked together, and we're excited to kind of try to weave some of those together. I'd say part of this is separate work we've done, but then also thinking of ideas of how it all comes together under the bigger umbrella of yield, quality, and just generally more precise vineyard management. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to go ahead and just open with something I think no one in this room needs me to say, but I just like to remind everyone, especially when people aren't as familiar with managing farms or vineyards, and that's that those of you who are managing farms know this, it is extremely complex, right? We have many different potential varietals, clones, rootstocks, training methods, trellising types, locations, site, environment, a lot of things to keep track of that are constantly changing as the plants are changing. And so we're just trying to keep this balance in the vineyard that leads to the right yield, the right quality, and all under the name of trying to do this more precisely and sustainably. And so I think it's a really challenging task. I think it's way harder than running a manufacturing facility, in my opinion. It's kind of like doing that, but if the manufacturing facility had sort of a mind of its own. So with that in mind, we also know that managing vineyards has really never been harder than it is right now. I truly think due to numerous things happening in terms of climate unpredictability and variability, challenges related to both scaling on high quality production farming systems. It's often quality, we need to give more attention to those plants, and so it's often challenging to give the same amount of attention and still scale. So that's a challenge, in addition to budget pressures, which we know increasing labor costs, amongst other input costs, are leading to really a squeeze on a number of people's budgets, especially in recent years. And then also the fact that we sort of have to balance the short-term tactical decisions that we have with longer-term strategic decisions around farm and vineyard management. And so I want to start off with, this is something I feel like we could really start developing and using and keeping track of year to year, which is the state of AI for the wine grape industry. Something I think a lot about is really both AI on just very broad picture. I love to keep track of all this and be involved in the details of that advancement, but also in terms of what it means for farming and the grape industry. And so I've sort of listed two columns here about what I think currently, this is like as of today, AI can do well and where it falls short. And then I'm going to go into some more details, but I just want to give this and let you guys chew on it a little bit. The first thing I think it can do well is detect, count, and measure what it can see in images. So I think AI has gotten pretty good at this. You show it an image, you show it where the grapes are at, or you show it where the shoots are at, you show it where different parts of an image are at in general, and it does a pretty good job of learning how to detect these things and then count them and do some measurements with them. It's also pretty good at identifying hidden patterns, and I say statistical because I don't think it really understands the biology very well, but in complex data sets. And so from that, we've also all experienced ChatGPT. I think most of us have, at least, in some form of what we call large language models. And they're getting really good at speaking to us. We can speak with them, understand what we're saying, and even reasoning. And you can give them language like voice, image, text, data, tabular data. And they do a pretty good job, right, of generally interacting with us and really kind of showing some understanding. Also on the robotics and mechanization side, AI is getting better and better at autonomously navigating and controlling machines on the farm. So that's more of kind of just driving up and down, turning around, doing these sorts of things. I think there's a number of people who've shown this can work. There's obviously still constraints in getting this operationally to happen across a lot of farms, but I think it's fairly mature. So on the right-hand side, I want to mention maybe where I think AI is falling short today. I think this is the way I like to think of this is like the human brain. We have a lot of different parts to it, right? And many people don't know this about me. In my undergrad almost ended up with a neuroscience degree. So I like to think of a lot of these things in context of what's going on in the human brain. And so, what we're really good at is this giant front part of our brain called the frontal cortex, which does a lot of high-level decision-making, planning, creative thinking, all of this kind of like challenging things that I think people farming are using intensively. And I think that kind of high-level viticultural planning and reasoning is still missing from AI. I think site-specific data and knowledge for vineyard analysis and operations. This is the thing, like if, right now when you talk to ChatGPT, it has no clue what's going on in your specific vineyard. So it can generally act as a broad viticulturalist, but it's really still challenged to understand your specific problems that you're thinking about that are really site-specific. And also mention that there's, the quantitative understanding of biology for robust and reliable forecasting. This is also, I think, still missing from these models. And then finally, automation or kind of the robotic control of high-touch, fine motor labor. I mean, things like pruning is a challenge to do at scale and the pace that humans can do it. Things like, even harvest, kind of selective harvest, all sorts of going in, thinning. I mean, we can do these things like mechanistic using machines, but I think being able to do them precisely as humans do, we're still a ways off. So, okay, with that in mind, I'm going to talk about a bit of opportunities for AI-supported vineyard management. I'm going to focus on a couple of these, and Beth's going to jump in here in just a bit on one of these as well. So these are the ones we're going to touch on today: are yield estimation, pest and pathogen management, and then a little bit of grape maturity and quality. In the last few minutes, I'm just going to bring it back and zoom out a little bit to tie it into the AI component as well. Okay, so yield estimation. I know a lot of you've heard me talking about this. As passion I have is trying to get better yield estimates for the industry and farming more generally. We know it's super important. We all know also that it's challenging. In an average year, we can do reasonably well if we predict the average, but the big challenge comes in those years that are high, over or under, right? And being able to reliably forecast this has repercussions all the way downstream for tank space planning, for your purchasing of barrels and all sorts of the chemical inputs you need in the winery, to labor contracting, and even grape contracts and or. Okay, so on the yield estimation side, I think we would all sort of agree that yield estimation is, at least has been, part guesswork and part fortune telling, right? Sort of joking when I say this, but in some ways it really is, it's a forecast, right? And so this is something I'm been trying to focus on a little bit more, is how we understand yield as a forecasting process and what other things we deal with on a day-to-day basis that we're comfortable using forecasts. And so I've really trying to push away from the use of the term yield estimation towards yield forecasting, because I think it's important to recognize that that is sort of what we're doing on the forecasting side. So this is here you can see an example of what I'm trying to demonstrate with 3 different plots. So the first one's showing how yield varies within a block and year to year. This is real data, and this is how we think of block level yield estimation. A lot of you have seen this. It's from Rob Bramley over in Australia. It's an older plot, but it's a pretty large example of just seeing year to year. You can see that there's pretty at least 2.5-fold variation in the same block, right? And I put it as this kind of one single color because we often think of yield at the block level. But whenever we start measuring and using yield monitors, what we see is there's a high level variability within any given field. And I think this is not news to many of you. Some of your fields are relatively homogeneous, and some that you're probably managing in the same branch might be pretty heterogeneous. And so we'll see something like easily another 4 to 8-fold variability within a block, and then the 2 to 3-fold variability from year to year. This makes yield forecasting pretty challenging, right? Knowing that this is the final outcome, especially when we're doing it at a block level. So I like to think of yield forecasting as a puzzle, and saying that, it does require all the pieces to understand it. It's not just the measurements of the fruit. It's not just the measurement of the shoots. It's not just the weights. It's a lot of complex biology and phenology and management all mixed together. So when we do this, I really, again, love to break this down into as much detail as we can in terms of the yield equation, moving all the way from how the phenology, the parts of this equation correspond to the phenology of the plant, right? So pre-season, we've got vines per block, moving into kind of late April, I'm assuming. Let's talk Napa here with cab or something. We've got shoots per vine, moving through clusters per shoot, berries per cluster, max grams per berry at physiological maturity, and then some potential dehydration happening all the way out to harvest. And all these parts, the way I think critically we have to think about them are that each of them gets mostly locked in at different parts of the season. Right, because once we do that, we can say, what do we know and what do we not know? And where is there uncertainty in this equation and where is there not? And that allows us to start ratcheting in the parts we know and putting uncertainty or ranges around the parts we don't know. So again, here, I think I want to mention that expert human measurements are definitely the gold standard, but the challenge is that they don't scale, right? So in other words, any of you know who've gone out and taken a lot of yield measurements, you know that this is particularly difficult work and that it's good to have, but what we really need is a way to kind of combine this with AI in order to get more intelligent sampling so that we can really bring the cost of that gold standard way down and eventually hopefully not have to go out and do much of this at all. I want to highlight here just a little bit about the things that are working. I mentioned earlier that detecting, measuring, and counting is something that AI's gotten pretty good at. And so this is sort of the base foundation of the data we need, but by no means gets us to where we need for a yield forecast. So this forms some of the base level information at different points in time. And this is just some examples of what it looks like when you start running these, what are called detection models using AI. Also want to mention that, yield estimation via aerial and satellite imagery, there's been a lot of research on it, and we've done a lot in our lab as well. But the challenge with this is that what we see is the canopy, right? We don't see the fruit. You could go out and do fruit thinning from one day to another, run the satellite, and you would have no clue that it happened. So this is a challenge with the aerial and satellite imagery, suggesting there's potential there because you get larger coverage, but you sort of miss the details of what's happening with the fruit and some of the management potentially. And then finally, I think there's, from the AI perspective, a lot of interesting work, and I know Beth's going to touch on some of the stuff she's been doing about using yield forecasting, tying into weather and climate. Here we have really these historic yield patterns are able to help quantify weather and climate sensitivities per block. So in other words, what parts of the block are more or less sensitive to climate? And then there's been a lot of improvement on the forecasting of these weather models in general. But really, the challenge we have is making sure that we have long time series of data looking back in terms of at least how the yield, cluster counts, and cluster weights ideally have varied in terms of weather and climate throughout the last 10, 20 years in a given location. It's not required to do this sort of modeling, but it really can start helping. Okay, and I'm going to touch on in another maybe couple minutes because I know we're running a bit behind. I'll try not to go too far on this before I hand it over to Beth. In terms of pest and pathogen management, I just think there's a lot that can be done here, and I know it's a big challenge facing growers today that we're all concerned about. Don't have to tell you that Napa, Sonoma, and much of the world faces various virus and disease risks, and specifically, there's some incredible work going on by Monica Cooper, Sarah McDonald, and various other researchers, both on the extension side and on the university research side, looking at these specific how to build a management system that's science-based. And so I want to shout out to, first and foremost, what they're doing, because I think this is incredible, incredible resources. Where it ties into AI is that we have the ability often to use visual symptoms, of course, not for pre-symptomatic, but usually for earlier stage, to do detection. And like I said, AI models are getting pretty good at using imagery for detection and classification types of problems. So here, the other piece is that I mentioned also pattern finding is something AI is getting particularly good at. And so if you're able to track, much like Monica and team have been encouraging us to do, where these different viruses are at and where we're observing them or potentially observing risks, it starts allowing us to make forecasts and predictions out using more sophisticated AI models. And I think this is an opportunity for linking that sort of phone-based or image-based types of data for a screening with what we have in terms of pattern finding on a broader Vineyard level year over year, right? I also want to mention the potential for what I think a lot of you have heard, some work from Katie Gold, Luca Briante, and some others working on spectral, hyperspectral imagery, multispectral imagery, and the potential for this to do some sort of pre-symptomatic screening. This really gives us non-visible types of light, encourages us to try to understand the chemical fingerprint of some of these disease signals before we can see them with the naked eye. So I think there's potential here, but the only challenge with these is these cameras are pretty expensive, and they also end up being kind of challenging to scale. So I think there's an opportunity for integration into a larger system, but what we tend to see is that we really are going to have challenge scaling these types of technologies due to cost limitations. So I think we've got to think of them as a suite, a tool in a tool belt. And then finally, I'm going to mention that ask the question of, this is some research again coming out from Monica Cooper and team, but is there a way we can link into this AI-based pattern matching to start helping us manage more precisely on where we might need to go out and quarantine rogue or kind of where we may be more or less concerned and get out ahead of disease spread before it actually happens. And so with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Beth to talk about some of the research she's been doing on great maturity, quality, and environment. And then we're going to come back in the last 4 or 5 minutes, and I'm just going to highlight a couple real zoomed out, big picture, future-looking pieces on the AI as it links to all this data. So hand it over to Beth here. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I'll try to come back in around 11:10 or so, maybe right before that. Thank you.
So thank you all for having me. Thank you to Napa Valley Grape Growers. Thank you, Mason. I've had a great pleasure of working with him for some time now, and we're actually getting to the point where I think we can do some really exciting things in the context of leveraging. We all already leverage AI in many parts of our life, but in leveraging it in a way where we integrate with industry and where we integrate with academics and also businesses. So I think there's this real power. I'm coming from the place of not having any affiliation with any corporate entity. I come from the place where why I love working with Napa Valley Grape Growers and will continue to do so and other entities, is what I would like to do is work with all of you to figure out how we can integrate organismal knowledge, industry collaboration, and data, and come from a place where we can offer things to industry and growers that are not just privatized, but to give general guidelines. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of my research and what I'm doing specific to Napa Valley, and then give you an idea of what I think some of the topics are that we could work on and leverage some of these data and some of these collaborations. But I will say, I am big on organismal knowledge, because there are often times when you get data or you get inferences from some of these models, just as Mason alluded to, where it's pattern finding. And pattern finding is great, but you can also bring in people who have deep organismal knowledge, both from industry and academia, and have the ability to look at that and assess whether there's validity to it, and then you refine the models. And I think that's a really critical piece. So just to give you some context for my research program, I am an evolutionary ecologist by training and a botanist. So I care a lot about understanding what's going on in the vineyard. And what my research program at Davis has become is really understanding how climate and environment impacts all of the things we care about in the vineyard in terms of vine health, water use, thinking about sustainability, and ultimately what my goal is to connect some of these patterns related to extremes in terms of thinking about this is just sort of the laundry list of extremes that I work on climatically. Cold snaps, droughts, water availability, wildfires, and heat waves is what I've worked with most extensively, but I work with all of this in terms of risks. And knowing that we have so much more variation than we ever have, and given year to year, that we can no longer just rely on necessarily our past knowledge or our intuition or feelings about things, and that's the power of AI. So the things I think about biologically and organismally are all of these pieces: genetics, what cultivar you're working with, what rootstock you're working with, all of the environmental parameters, and then really how that interacts with management and how we can incorporate all these pieces. And the big question that I'm interested in is how we can increase sustainability, so reducing inputs, water being a huge one, while maximizing not only yield, but also quality, and how we can do that in a rigorous way, and how we even want to define quality, knowing it's a target that changes for different people's stylistic preferences. And so in the past, I've done a lot of work on heat waves, wine, and water demand. And I just want to note that there's been dramatic reductions. There's economic concerns, but there's been dramatic reductions in actual grape production that are due to, for the first time, OIV, the International Organization for Grape and Wine, of which the US is now part of, but last year noted that it is due to climatic variability. It's the first time they've ever said that, and pests and diseases, which are integrally linked. And so what I want to talk about today is a couple different things that I'm working on that I think there's a lot of room for integration and collaboration for, and one which many of you have heard me talk about, this notion of establishing a new Winkler Index and understanding how climate impacts both yield and primarily quality, and how variation in climate can impact that. I'm not going to really talk about this, but this is something that I'm working on with Mason, is relationships between yield and quality, and how if you have data on both the yield and berry size, you can link some of that to what decisions you might make at certain times of the year. And then I'm going to touch on regenerative practices, not in the context of carbon storage necessarily, but long-term, how you can have climate mitigation. And then just the room for real-time risk assessments. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is that given whatever input you have for your site, that if you do have a really rich data set, then really rich models based on that, that you have the ability to say, I foresee this heat wave coming, or I know that the smoke risk is much higher. Do I want to harvest now? And what outcome does that mean for winemaking for me? And how much money can I save? So I'll move through my work pretty quickly. I think that some of you already have context for it, but what I just want to do is show you the data that I have, that I am beginning to work with other partners and establish that so I can build the data set and then make it so that it's a large enough data set to actually analyze it in some of these neural network approaches. But I will say that what I always do is link it back. So you find the patterns and then you link it back to rigorous experimental data and modeling of actual processes, biological processes. So this is something that I started a few years ago now, understanding how we can link where you should grow certain grape cultivars in different climate regions. And we're using Napa as a model for that, noting that this original Winkler classification based on growing degree days classified all of Napa as a region 2, and based on current climate normals, it spans regions 2 through 5 now. It's one of the most climatically and edaphically diverse, or soils-based diverse regions in the world, and it's a great place to do this work. So all I'll say is that for the last, from 2021 to 2024, and then we combined with a 2015 data set, we had 60 to 70 blocks and a bunch of industry partners sampling grapes and doing all of the grape chemistry and analysis in-house, and having sensors out there for weather data, and collecting a ton of other data. I still have some holdouts. I'm going to come after you today probably for some of the viticultural data. But we have it completed up to 2023. We're working on analyzing it now. But I will say what the goal is to ask, how do climatic differences in some of the soil parameters and differences in some of the management impact quality? And can we start building this database to then inform going forward what decisions you might make? And so what I want to do is, this is data from James Campbell. What I want to do is just present what the variation that we've seen in Napa Valley in the last decade even, and that Napa Valley, even within a given region, has fluctuated between 3 Winkler regions. We are not in a static state. So 2015 was one of the hottest years on record. Gives you context, that's over 2,000 Goring degree days. For those of you, this is based at Oakville Station, so just to give you context. And I'm just showing you the climate data from the vintners. It is interesting because it was hot, but it wasn't as extreme. And so there are some really important matters here about how many, what we're starting to look at is how many days you have in certain phenophases of extremes, because that's driving a lot of the patterns of quality. So 2015 being the hottest, and you can see that 2023 was literally one of the, so that's going from a Winkler 2 region to a Winkler 4 region within a span of under 10 years. This is what the new normal is. Every year will present challenges we have never seen before. Just like last year was the hottest July on record, this year is one of the coolest Julys on record. So you can't walk into your vineyard and say you're going to do the same thing every year. And that's what we're trying to understand for saying, how early can we predict what you should do or what you can see in terms of some of these quality parameters. So I just wanted to show you this to really emphasize how much variation there is and the reality. And then what I want to talk about is how with the data we've collected, we have thousands now of samples from veraison or 10 to 12 bricks all the way to up to 28 at all of these sites. And what we're doing is modeling the relationship between anthocyanin content, which is one of the most important parameters for thinking about quality. We're doing a slew of other things from chemistry, and we're doing we're looking at not just anthocyanins, but the different components of anthocyanins. And it's really important to note that what we are seeing in general, 2023 I can explain in 1 second, and then I'm going to move quickly because I know we don't have too much time. But just note that from 2015, there was a really past 25 bricks, or 24, you have a really strong drop in amount of anthocyanins in that hot year. And even more so if I go back, can I go back? Maybe I can't go back. What's that? Oh, it did go back. Okay, so 2022, I want to point out, which we all remember, what happened in 2022. Could have been a great year, and then what happened is half of the growers we worked with decided to harvest, half of them decided not to. And then you can see that those, that decided not to had, for the 2022 data, had a complete loss of color. And that translates to a huge economic loss. So you want to know when you're at this sort of decision point, what do I do? Do I water excessively? Arguably no. You may not have those resources. And what will be the outcome? And so that's what we're trying to do now, is do that for quality and think about in the context of anthocyanins. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. I think you all get these slides, so I just want to have this so you have this. We also are doing this for Chardonnay and doing it for aromatics across Sonoma and in Napa. So we're building a red-based model and a white-based model, and then we have planted common vineyards in here and that are working with France and Australia to do the same thing for a set of 65 cultivars. And now we have that planting out at Oakville Station so that people can use it to understand some of the quality parameters and think about other cultivars. So this is work that a graduate student in my lab is doing, and I know many of you have interacted with her to get site-level data. I think I want to touch on this briefly, but I think one other really huge opportunity at broad scales and by working with industry is understanding how regenerative practices and practices that change the soils and change your ability to grow well and retain water and change soil health parameters. A lot of it has been focused on carbon storage, but I actually think the richest outcome of adopting some of these practices is climate extreme mitigation. And so what I'm doing, this is a study with Dominus. We're also starting one at Oakville Station and working with others to actually build a broader data set, is understanding how if you eliminate tillage, and I know it's not that simple, but if you eliminate tillage and you use different cover crops and you keep cover crop into the season, however you terminate it, over long time periods, you have initial benefits, but over long time periods, how long does it take for changes in your soil health to help aid in climate mitigation? And there's great data out there in the realm of ecology and biodiversity ecosystem function literature that you have huge benefits over time that are indirect related to increasing soil organic matter and soil physical properties. So I just want to state that this is again I'm going to move to this, but this is again with Dominus, who has graciously done an experiment with us at different spatial scales of initiating no-till. And what I think we can use is use some of that drone data or that large-scale data to understand how much of a difference it makes. So this is how much of a difference. You can see it visually from these drone flights about how there's massive differences in surface temperature. This is just at one time point. So imagine that if you have a 1.5 to 3 degree difference between using till and no-till, not just at a single time point, but persistent over the season, that is a huge change in your local climate or your microclimate of your vine. And so this is just at the beginning of the study. This is before we even link it to any of the soil parameters. And so I just want to close by stating that what I think the possibility is with all working together and integrating all of these studies is that what we can build is all of that complexity that Mason spoke about and that we know is real for viticulture, is we have this ability to integrate data and different people's knowledge, industry being absolutely essential. I can't do what I do without industry, working with industry and working with groups like Napa Valley Grape Growers, and being able to say, this is where I'm at. I'm at this critical decision-making point at some time during the season, or just periodically. What do I do if I know this is the forecast, or I'm concerned? Or even if you don't know, you know that all of a sudden there's great smoke risk, and you know that that is something that potentially could happen. At what point do you decide to make different decisions and have that link directly to your stylistic goals? And be able to say, just like we use ChatGPT, you ask them, this is my site, I don't know what to do about whether to harvest now or next week or apply water now, and what will the potential outcome be? Even if you put in some parameters that where you're at in your vineyard. So that ultimately is the goal, so that we don't sit there and use our emotions to make decisions when things are changing. And that, I think, is where we're at with the future. And so I just want to thank all of my funding sources in my lab. And I also just want to say I threw this in at the end because this is a huge part work I'm doing in the sensing perspective, is how to use spectral data as a metric for berry chemistry. And so when you're out there getting data on, and right now it's been primary chemistry we've done, but we're doing a really nice job with thinking about anthocyanins too. And so can we use that as another data source if people are doing integration? This is hyperspectral data, but what we're trying to do is discover the indices to make multispectral data that would be the best, and we're also linking that to smoke. So can we do scans, and this is linking leaf level to berry level. Can we look at the leaf level chemistry and leaf level spectral signatures and decide whether to sample for smoke? And decide, hey, this is showing up, and there's already data, that hyperspectral data, which is distinguished from stress, some of the other stresses, can detect compounds in the leaves associated with smoke impact. And so there's some of the other pieces that I'm working on that I just wanted to throw in there if people are interested. Okay, I went over, but I did my best. Perfect. And how do you?
Mason, do you want to come back in the room?
Yeah.
Oh, there you
Can you
are.
guys hear me again? I'm
And then
sorry, I don't know if
we'll
I'm
do Q&A
super
after
loud
he's
or.
done. You're all set.
Okay, great. I'm gonna just do a couple minutes real quick, and then Beth and I wanted to open it up for Q&A, I think, after that, if that works. Let me share my screen one more time. So thank you, Beth. Yeah, every time I talk to Beth, we have like tons of ideas and new projects, and then we continue to try to hone in on the generally same topics, but it's just like every year the data gets richer and the questions get richer too. So um, I wanted to bring it back. I think you kind of set this one up really well, Beth, even not knowing it. I wanted to talk a little bit about like what's missing from, this is zooming way out for a second, right? What's missing from generic AI assistants today with respect to managing vineyards? Right. And I think most of us in the room have probably used some form of a large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or one of these. This is the interface we get, right? We've got it's actually really pretty incredible to start talking with these at first. And you've got your set of knowledge as a viticulturalist or vineyard owner or, finance or business side. And you go in and say, how do we, ask questions about vineyards and viticulture? And when you start asking, interrogating the AI models, you're like, wow, they're pretty knowledgeable. But they sort of fall short, right? And here's the reasons I think they fall short for actually being useful right now. I think one of them is that they don't have access to your data, right? They don't have access to your data. All they really have access to is a little snippet of your knowledge, but they really don't have access to that much of your knowledge without you telling them, your experience of growing grapes for 15, 20 years, whatever that is very hard to capture and give that context to the AI model. And then one of the challenges too is that even though we say your data, they don't have access to your data, that data itself is often not digitized right now in farming and viticulture, right? We have some of it maybe in Excel spreadsheets or handwritten notes or in some databases somewhere, but it's really not in a way that's easy to provide such that when you ask questions, the AI model has that context of your specific vineyard and your specific experience at those sites. And so I think that's the big challenge. And what Beth mentioned is like, that's sort of the vision for the future, right? Is how do we make these models, these AI models, useful, that we can actually use them and they become an assistant that's a useful assistant that helps us really focus on the pieces of the management and vineyard that need to be focused on. Okay, I'm just going to highlight this one more time of saying that where does AI fall short today? I've listed these pieces here and want to come back to this diagram, which I think is a really valuable one, which is sort of going from data, which is that raw data. Think of the GPS information, the images that we collect, weather data, all of this kind of sensor level data, up to information where we sort of start bringing that together into useful terms. But I often hear this is where I think many current people feel challenged to say like, well, what do I do with the data? And so once you start getting into the sort of like knowledge and wisdom part of the pyramid, I feel like this is where Beth said like organismal knowledge, biological knowledge, these sorts of things where we can start interpreting the patterns and acting on them in useful ways. This is where we operate, where you operate as managers and farm, viticulturalists, et cetera. But this is sort of where the data and AI models are living right now. And so we've got to move up this pyramid, right, from data up to wisdom, where we can, on a daily basis, pull out whether it's the phone or when we get home to the computer, we can quickly and efficiently ask questions that give us the kind of knowledge, wisdom level information, whether that's yield, where should I go, what's my anticipated yield forecast, what should I do about, where are the areas I should focus on for roguing, et cetera. That would be useful information. But right now, that's where we've got to get to. And so the final thing I want to mention is just shout out to both UC Davis for doing an incredible job of allowing us to do some technology transfer. It's been several years now that we have co-founded Scout. And so I wanted to just shout out, and that's sort of one of the inspirations for what we wanted to do. We ran into a limitation of building many different sensors, et cetera, at one point 3 or 4 years ago and thinking, okay, postdocs are going to kill me if I keep asking them to do this sort of thing. How can we get out and try to translate this to industry? So that's where we started. And since then, I think it's been a really amazing growth opportunity and chance to go ahead and make a big impact, hopefully, on industry. So I just want to throw that out there and kind of, this talk's supposed to be mostly about UC Davis and us being able to focus really on what we've done, on the research side, but I wanted to give the shout out as well to the ability of tech transfer at universities and the importance of that and how we really, I think, could just continue using UC Davis and other Cal Poly, these farming focused institutions to jumpstart a lot of important technology that's needed in the grape and wine industry. So with that, I'm going to open up to Q&A. I know I think we started a little late, but I think we hopefully still have time for 8 minutes or something based on when we started. So I'll stop sharing there and pass it back over to you guys.
Thank you, Mason. We got questions.
So based on the amount of people in this room, people are very eager to begin implementing this, but as Roz touched on before, there's still those concerns over data safety and privacy. Could you give some practical steps that growers could take today to start exploring from a foundation of data safety?
Sure. I think that one's probably geared at me, but Beth, please feel free to comment because you've been working a lot with growers. So I think both of us probably have some comments on this. I'll be really quick. So I think from the AI and data side, I've had a mixed experience with grower side. Now on the winery side, I think I've heard there's a lot more kind of proprietary concerns. From a lot of growers I've worked with, they said if you can help me do this more cost effectively and in a way that kind of hits my targets better, I'm very interested in working on this type of challenge because it's a big I don't think there's the data itself. Now, if it's management related data, obviously there's a lot of, knowledge and wisdom kind of experience that goes into that. But on the data side, the raw data side, I think probably less of a concern. That being said, disease I know is one that is also a challenge. So I think there's a lot of ways of dealing with the data safety and privacy side. It's pretty straightforward to keep the data private and safe. And I think there is an opportunity for broad trends in AI, from what you can get from the data can be shared and beneficial across the board. So to bring the entire boat up, I think that is sort of something that definitely groups like Napa Valley Growers and industry associations, ABA associations could spearhead. And I would certainly encourage that sort of level of communication and collaboration with the people building the technology. So Beth, I don't know if you have any comments on your experience there you wanted to mention.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a different kind of relationship when you're dealing with private companies, but even in the academic context, so everyone who I work with, we have formal agreements that are actually dictated also by UC Davis and our legal team. So it's very clear what we can do. I will always publish. My goal is not to use, I don't care what data is used for, frankly, personally, what is used for anything to sell products. That's not where I'm coming from. I want them to be better, it's useful for industry. My goal is to use collective data to make things publicly accessible. That is where I'm coming from. And so I work with 70 to 80 different sites and 50 different growers, and I have built relationships with them. And so there is I do not see, never have I had an instance, and I'm doing like climate and quality, which is a very sensitive issue, but never has anything been disclosed. Everything is double blinded. I also have NDAs with certain people I work with. So you as the grower get to dictate the level of what you're comfortable with and what you share and what you want back. And the idea is to give you back. Like in a lot of instances, whether you pay for it or not, you get back what is done. I don't ask people to pay for any of the things that I do, but I can give back all of the chemistry data that I do. Then also we can give back inferences and we can give back information that I think are really necessary. So I think that we need to move away from being really hesitant around that. I think that there isn't a lot of risk and there's a lot of benefit that can be gained.
I think the question is regarding the climate change, what can be done reactively in the same year? Because like in some of the conversation, this came up, like, should I be concerned about climate change? And the reaction that I personally got from one of the growers was, assume the worst, and that's the best way to go. So can we do something reactively about climate change, even if we detect it in the same year, rather than doing something proactive, which takes 2 to 3 years?
So yes. That's why you need to understand patterns that exist and integrate information, because you can say, okay, we know based on this information that if you have this level, if you have this much water and you know what's coming and you know where you're at and what you've experienced in the beginning of the year, then you can, that's the goal is to say, then you can make this decision based on history climatically, just like Mason showed the prediction of yield too. If you're trying to hit a certain yield target and you know you're gonna have this climatic pattern this year, this is where you're gonna go, but all of a sudden if you see forecasted something like a heat wave, or you know there are other factors coming up that yes, you can react within one season, make a decision that will heavily impact both your yield and your quality. And it doesn't have to be, it might inform what you do in 2 or 3 years. It might inform what you do, and this is the important part about organismal knowledge too, it might inform what you do when you replant. You might decide you can't make this decision about, regenerative practices if you have X rootstock and you have this future climate. So I do think that you can react in real time and make decisions that'll be helpful.
Thank you.
So one of my questions kind of about all of this like data, that pyramid you showed about the data, information, whatever knowledge, is there, I know companies like Scout and other companies are kind of working on that at a proprietary level, but is there any tips you can kind of like give growers if they have all of this proprietary information and are trying to train their own AI model based on their sources? Like they've got all this historical data, GPS data, and all these other kind of valuable data points. Is there a way that they can kind of build a model in-house right now? Or something like that, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, I could talk about that for a minute. I think so thinking about back to the pyramid piece I mentioned earlier, I think the first part is standardizing your data and making sure that you're collecting sort of the right data. And I think that's useful across the board, right? There's no one university researcher or company that's going to, do it all. I think there's a big kind of ecosystem that needs to be built, just like there is in a lot of other industries already. And so I think that's going to be one of the big things, is standardizing the data and going ahead and having standardization, centralization of data, I think helps a lot. And then in terms of training the AI models, I think, like I said, there's certain things that where commoditization has really helped of AI. And so that's like the pieces of just being able to detect a grape cluster, this sort of thing, right? But the challenge is whenever you have so much data, I guess, like being able to go from that level of I detected something to then counting something to then integrating it into the geospatial system to then percolating that up into sort of management actions. I think that's been surprisingly a lot of work. And I think that's where we get a little stuck on the industry side, is being able to go in and kind of move it from that, hey, I process the data, up into the integration in the higher level piece. I think there are tools out there for the lower level ones. And I think there's a lot of good providers on the data side and even the kind of capturing and measuring things. I think, so I think it's turned out to be, whenever I started this research 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of these tools for doing that didn't exist. And so I think that's become a lot easier. I think bringing all of it together is still the challenge, but I think there's a lot of in-house knowledge. And so I think that's the piece that definitely the biological and management side, that's critical to that equation. So I think that figuring out how to bring that in is definitely, you have to build it, I guess, if you're going to do it in-house. And so that's sort of where the challenging part, I think, would come in probably. I don't know if that gives you a specific enough answer, but I think that's the hardest part of the equation we've experienced so far, both on the academic side and the company side.
I'm just going to interject really quickly and say, because I've worked so much with grower data, as it would be great if like even Napa Valley grape growers or other groups actually did something where there was like a session that was like, okay, this is how we want you to curate and work with your data. These are the critical pieces we want you to record, because so much is lost. When we talk about longitudinal data, the amount of work I have to do to get tiny tidbits of information that no one knows what it is. I don't know, I'm going to be honest, I know very few growers, even the largest, who do a good job of this. And there's so many tools out there. So I think that's actually the big piece, is learning about data curation and standardization and using AI tools like Mason referred to, and maybe having there be something like a workshop or something like that that's like, this would be a great way to do it. You can contribute, you can do it in-house, you can use it as any way you want to, but that's really critical, I think.
Thank you both so much. We're going to have to move to our next presentation, but round of applause for Mason and Beth.